Thank you very much, Yasser. Thank you to the organizers of this important panel for inviting me to be with you this afternoon. It's an important anniversary coming up, August 2016, 3 years after one of the worst massacres in modern political history that occurred in Cairo at Rabaa Square. I'm here because I was part of a team that produced this 188-page report called All According to Plan, which is about the massacre at Rabaa, but also about the actually series of incidents in and around Cairo in the summer, in July and August of 2013, after the coup that overthrew President Morsi and installed the then Defense Minister, Mr. Sisi. I think it's, I was reminded how important it was to have these kinds of events by an interview that was, or an article that was in the New York Times exactly a week ago. It was based mainly on interviews with Nabil Fahmy, who, as you may recall, was the foreign minister, Egypt's foreign minister in the immediate aftermath of the coup, and then later went on to be the Secretary General of the Arab League. And Mr. Fahmy said that he considered, as the reporter put it, quieting Western concerns over Mr. Morsi's removal and portraying it as, quote, defending the revolution as one of his top foreign policy achievements during his time as foreign minister. Well, I'm frankly not sure how well he quieted Western concerns, but of course at the same time I'm also very aware of the extent to which we have not been as successful as we would like in heightening Western concerns. I mean, the coup is one thing, a political act, but for us at Human Rights Watch, it's the many, many human rights violations that occurred along with the coup. Of course, there were human rights violations in Egypt before the coup as well, but what we saw was an escalation and intensification of human rights abuses that go on to this day. I mean, we're not only talking about the events of July and August 2013. I mean, that's what I'm talking about today, but the context is, you know, an escalation of repression. I was just looking this morning, actually. I saw the National Council for Human Rights, which is a quasi-governmental Egyptian institution, nominally independent, but it's appointed by the government. It's commissioners, and they just published their annual report. And one of the things that caught my eye, as you may know, it's been very difficult for organizations like Human Rights Watch, outside human rights organization, even more difficult for Egyptian human rights organizations inside Egypt to carry on their work. And one of the strictures that are now in place, or now being enforced, actually it was on the books as a law for many, many decades, but now being rather strictly enforced, is the prevention of the human rights groups in Egypt, or any NGOs in Egypt, of receiving foreign funds, which frankly is what's needed to carry on critical work like human rights reporting. They have to get the permission of the government. And according to the semi-official, quasi-official National Human Rights Institution in Egypt, 98% of the applications over the last year were turned down. So, you know, it's not just a question of get permission, it's a question of be denied, make it impossible. So it makes it all the more important, I think, to carry on this work. Let me use most of my minutes here this afternoon, though, to talk about our documentation of what happened in August 2013. In those 2 months of July and August, according to what we could find and document, well over 1,150 people were killed in 5 separate incidents, and most of those minimally that is, we can provide the names of 817 people killed in the Rabaa massacre. We have every reason to think, and I'll try and elaborate on that now, that there are many more, and the real number is probably, although we don't have the names to actually document it, well over 1,000 just in that one incident. We took a year to carry out the research. Basically, between July 2013, we had colleagues, staff members on the ground in Cairo. We, at that time, had an office in Cairo. So they were present on the days of these incidents. In many cases, we're able to observe the incidents firsthand and certainly talk with witnesses, doctors, and so forth. And that's the way we do our work. So we do it directly. We don't rely on media reports. Of course, we're informed by reliable media reports, but we do the interviews directly ourselves. We make sure that the witnesses we talk to actually saw what they say they saw. So if it turns out, and it often does turn out, you're talking to somebody, well, how do you know this? How do you know this happened? Well, so-and-so told me. That's not good enough for us. We go and say, okay, can we talk to so-and-so and track it down? Otherwise, you know, frankly, we don't use it. It doesn't make the case. And I think we have made the case in this report pretty conclusively as to what went on. And what we determined, to sort of summarize it, is that in August in Rabaa, on August 14th, I believe it was, we saw police and army, mostly police, but with the support of the armed forces, systematically, intentionally using excessive use of lethal force, resulting on killings on a scale unprecedented in Egypt. The evidence, on-site investigations, more than 200 witnesses, and when I talk about witnesses, I'm talking about people who actually saw what went on. Witnesses including protesters, doctors, medical personnel, journalists who were there, lawyers, and local residents, many of whom themselves were quite antipathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood and the demonstration. And indeed, it was their complaints to the authorities that were the excuse, at least, that the authorities used to initiate the clearing of the square. We concluded that because the killings were on a massive basis and because they occurred over, as I said, at least 5 different incidents that we were able to examine, their widespread and systematic nature suggested they were part of a policy to attack, to use lethal force against unarmed demonstrators, unarmed protesters and bystanders. And that amounts to, according to international law, amounts to crimes against humanity. Now, this is not a charge or an allegation that we would make lightly. Believe me, my colleagues in our legal department make sure that we can actually substantiate the basis for these crimes. Now, we're not talking about evidence that would be in a court of law, okay? But we're talking about allegations that are serious and that are well documented. What we documented was the fact that on August 14th, very early in the morning, like at more or less the crack of dawn, around 6:30 a.m., we saw armored personnel carriers, bulldozers, snipers, police, and army attacking the Rabaa Square encampment and killing, as I said, at least 817 that we know of, and likely well over 1,000. We found that security forces opened fire using live ammunition indiscriminately, with snipers, gunmen inside and alongside APCs firing at relatively close range, but firing on crowds, okay? Now, the government had been warning for a long time that it intended to clear Rabaa Square. However, in those warnings in the days and weeks before August 14th, they had said that they were going to arrange safe exits, there were going to be lots of warning. None of that, of course, happened. There were no safe exits until the very end of the day, almost 12 hours later after the attack started. And there were loudspeaker warnings on that morning, starting around 5:30 or so, or but literally in the minutes before the attack started. There were recorded looped warnings that, because we're talking about, the government says at least 20,000, we think it was probably more like 60, 70, 80,000 people in the square at that time. As you can imagine, not everybody, in fact, very few people actually heard those warnings. And in any case, as I said, it was minutes before the attack started, with armored personnel carriers, with snipers, with lethal force, as well as tear gas and all the rest that security forces often use. So even if they had heard the warnings, there was no way for them to actually escape. There were 5 sort of main entrance-exit paths into Rabaa Square. The attack, from the very start, focused on all 5. So there was no one of those paths was sort of left open for people to escape. I said it was one of the bloodiest events in Egyptian history. It's actually one of the bloodiest events in recent world history, at least that we know of. So by comparison, in 1998, the Tiananmen Square massacre that is well known around the world, the estimates are between 400 and 800 people killed. Okay, terrible, for sure. And at the high end, close to Rabaa. And we saw a similar, that was during a 24-hour span. And then in 1989, a year later, Uzbek forces killed roughly similar number in one day in the Andijan, that was in 2005, Andijan massacre. So we're talking about an attack started around 6:30 in the morning and in Rabaa, and ended around 5:36, 6:30 in the evening. So 12 hours. Injured protesters, dead, bodies of protesters quickly filled the Rabaa hospital that was, very proximate to the square, and to makeshift medical tents that had been set up. The vast majority, according to the doctors we spoke with, were gunshot wounds to the head and chest, indicating an intent to not only do harm, but actually to kill. Security forces fired on these medical facilities and on people trying to enter and leave the medical facilities. The shooting, the massive shooting, became particularly intense by around 8 a.m., 9, 10 a.m. in the morning, okay? The resistance, which was mainly through rocks and Molotov cocktails and that sort of thing, seemed to hold up the advance of the security forces for a while. There was a pause during midday in the heavy firing, and then it resumed in the mid-afternoon for a couple of hours until finally the security forces did manage to take and expel all of the, what started out as a very, very large number of protesters. I mean, we analyzed satellite video shots of Rabaa Square a few weeks earlier before the incident, and our estimate, or the experts we consulted, estimated that there were 85,000 people in the square at that time. Now, as you know, it was easy to come and go. And I talked with many people myself who had been there on certain days and not there on other days. We also know, at least I would say impressionistically, based on the people I spoke with after the event. I was not in Cairo at this time, but I did some of the interviews and research in the subsequent months in Cairo. People didn't leave so much as come when there was that sense just before August 14th that the attack was about to happen. People came in to be part of it, either to witness it or to express support for the protesters. So there's every reason to think that maybe it wasn't 85,000, but it was many tens of thousands of people at the time of the attack. Now, the government, and particularly the Interior Minister, Mohammed Ibrahim, alleged in a press conference that later that day that the use of force by security forces was in response to violence and gunfire by the protesters. We did find, we did collect testimonies, accounts, and what we regard as reasonable evidence that, in fact, a small number of protesters did possess firearms, they did fire on the police, but this level of violence in no way justified this deliberate, indiscriminate killings of protesters. As I said, what we saw was them firing into this very large sea of humanity, okay? So they weren't trying to pick off people who were firing at them, as might be reasonable to do. No, instead they were firing on the protesters. We also saw, and we have video, tapes of this as well as witness accounts. Police were standing on top of these armored personnel carriers firing. Now, this is not something any sensible police officer would do if there were a lot of people in the crowd firing weapons at them. It just wouldn't be very smart. So, not evidence exactly, but an indication that the violence, the government's account of violence on the part of the protesters is greatly exaggerated, to say the least. Of course, this wasn't the only incident of clearing demonstrations that happened on that day, August 14th. There was also Anata Square, and the report I referenced earlier, it's on our website, all according to plan. It was published in August of 2014, and there we have very detailed accounts of all the different incidents that we looked at. There were also, as you know, there were allegations, particularly on the part of, adversaries, opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood, and of people in the neighborhood who were, look, this was 80,000 people in this neighborhood. It was very difficult to get around, even walking, never mind in cars and so forth. So, we're talking about many weeks of great inconvenience at a minimum. But there were more serious allegations that there were that the protesters, or at least some of the organizers, leaders of the protest, were abusing people that they suspected or accused of being collaborators and so forth, that this kind of thing was going on. We found this is probably true. We weren't able to nail it down conclusively, but I think there's reason to think it's, some of that was going on. But again, as with the allegation that some protesters were firing at police, it may justify a decision to try and clear the square, okay? But it certainly doesn't justify the way the authorities went about clearing the square with the indiscriminate firing. It's also clear to us, and it's why we titled our report All According to Plan, that the authorities, in fact, expected that this method, this means of clearing the square, would result in many more casualties, many more fatalities than actually happened, okay? The Interior Minister Ibrahim said on August 31, so 2 weeks later, said they had estimated losses of 10% of the people in the square, and that in the square were more than 20,000 people. As I've discussed the numbers before, anyway, they were expecting, as he said, thousands of casualties. The Prime Minister Bablawi at the time told Masri al-Yom on August 14th that that 1,000 people were killed. And this is a quote from Prime Minister Rabaa: "We expected much more than what happened. The final outcome was less than we expected." So this was not an accident. This was not, rogue officers that were all of a sudden going out of control when the actual operation started. Okay, this was expected. The authorities went ahead with this plan, this particular plan to clear the square, which was at odds with what they had been saying up to August 14th about how they were going to do it safely, and allow people to leave who wanted to leave, and so forth. On the numbers, just a couple of points. So the head of the Forensic Medical Authority, which is a governmental body, announced that the final death toll in Rabaa was 627. The National Council for Human Rights, which I mentioned before, they did their own report, which came out in March 2014, and used a figure of 624 civilians killed. We believe this is a serious undercount. We compare those figures with evidence that we saw of 246 additional deaths that were documented by Egyptian civil society groups, and there were incredible reports of additional bodies found buried in provinces outside of Cairo, and so they weren't all taken to, the Forensic Medical Authority basically counts the bodies that show up in the morgue. Now, when this many people are killed in a single incident, you can imagine that not every corpse, not every body of somebody who was killed would necessarily end up in the morgue. So, that roughly speaking is how we account for the difference between our numbers and the much lower numbers of the authority. Although, 627 people is not a small number, even if we were to take that as, as the word. Now, just a word about sort of the legal basis for our findings. So, according to international legal standards, okay, human rights law, various conventions that have been developed under the auspices of the UN over the years, treaties that Egypt itself is a signatory to. So, you can use lethal force in a policing situation. And this was a policing situation. It was not an armed conflict. It was not two sides or several sides, in an armed conflict situation such as you might see today in Libya or Iraq or Syria, okay? This was a large one to be sure, but it was a policing operation at the end of the day. And they may have been justified in using some degree of force to stop the armed attacks from the protesters, or even to disperse a protest that was, a public security issue, public security menace, even if you want to go that far. But again, let me repeat, and this is, according to these international legal standards, absolutely no justification for the manner and the scale of the violence that the Egyptian security forces employed on that day and in these other incidents that we documented. Under international law, security forces, police, and army forces operating as police, which is what we're talking about on this day, they're under a strict duty to take all feasible precautions, all feasible measures to ensure that there's a minimal risk to human life. And this is something, obviously, the organizers of this clearance operation comprehensively failed to do. We identified, as I said, we concluded that the numbers were large enough, and the fact that they were not talking about one incident, but a number of incidents happening over a period of time, resulting in minimally, by our documentation, 1,150 fatalities. And the systematic nature. In other words, in these other 4 incidents that we documented, the numbers the numbers at the end of the day were much lower, but they were high. There were 91 killed in this incident, 125 in this incident, and so forth. So we're seeing the same pattern again and again in incidents, mostly before, and in one case after August 14th. So our report finally, we identified some of the senior security officers and leaders in the chain of command in Egypt who we said should be investigated, and where there's evidence of responsibility, held individually accountable for planning and executing this operation and failing to prevent these widespread systematic killings. One was the Interior Minister, Mohammed Ibrahim, who formulated, or whose office formulated the dispersal plan and oversaw its implementation. And who himself said that he, quote, ordered the special forces to advance and purify, unquote, the key buildings at the heart of Rabaa Square. Another person we'd recommend, we said really should be investigated, his role should be investigated, was the person who was then the defense minister, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who of course is now the president. He held a command position, role over the armed forces, obviously, which was among the forces opening fire on the protesters in a number of these incidents, not just Rabaa Square. And then the third person, or of the three top people, would be the commander, the special forces head and commander of the Rabaa operation, Midhat Minshawi, who told Interior Minister Ibrahim from Rabaa Square on the morning of August 14th, quote, "We will attack whatever it costs us." Now, it did cost, there were, I think, something like 8 police who were killed, 8 members of the security forces who were killed that day. You may recall that I think it was the very evening of August 14th, or perhaps it was a day later, the Interior Minister went on television, Egyptian television, and showed an array of semi-automatic rifles and pistols and so forth, and said, "We found 15 of these." 15 people had, lethal weapons, and that somehow justified an attack that cost the lives of minimally over 800 people. That's the kind of disproportion. That's how you arrive at a term like excessive use of lethal force. We identified a few other people as well. Mohammed Farid Touhani, the head of General Intelligence Services, some of the key Interior Ministry deputies, and so forth. It's notable that 2 things are notable. First of all, the government has refused any public disclosure, really any information on the dispersals. Even, I'm talking about today, 3 years later, still no disclosure of information, no disclosure of what the plan, I mean, we saw how it operated, but what was the plan that they were operating from? And of course, we've seen no accountability. Okay, there have been no investigations into the role of individual members of the security forces, much less into the roles of these higher-ups, the Interior Minister, the Defense Minister, and so forth. Again, 3 years later, nothing. What we've seen instead is bonuses paid to the security forces who participated in the operation, monuments built in their honor, and so forth. So, this is the reason that we've called, I'm sorry to say so far without success, on the international community, and specifically the UN Human Rights Council, to set up an independent commission of inquiry to look into these events, and with the possibility that those would, further the options of, at least if not justice in Egypt, then justice internationally. When you're talking about crimes against humanity, you're talking about if these individuals that I mentioned, the former Interior Minister, Mr. Sisi himself, travels abroad, we're talking about crimes that are justiciable in courts. Certainly the countries that have also signed on to these international treaties. Now, as president, Mr. Sisi himself, at least for as long as he's president, is probably immune from that kind of a legal processing, but nevertheless, there are Egyptian individuals who should be investigated, who do come and go to various Western capitals. Again, nothing has transpired yet along those lines, but we think that's why there's still that need for that independent commission of inquiry. And until there's that kind of independent inquiry, you know, we have again urged, again, unfortunately without success, that governments like the United States, like the EU member states and so forth, refrain from providing military and certainly security forces with equipment, training, and so forth, until there is some serious accountability. So we've got a long way to go. Again, as I said at the very outset of my remarks, I think it's extremely important that anniversaries like August 14th, 2013, that we remember that on August 14th, 2016. And so thank you very much for inviting me here today.